What I've been talking about in previous segments in this larger lecture of labor in the underclass is designed, I suppose, to try and give you a sense of what life was like, not for the captains of industry, but for many Americans, many new Americans who had immigrated to this country, but also Americans who had left what they'd known on the farm to seek out employment and city life in a new sort of industrial America. I suggested earlier that out of the conditions that people faced in the cities in particular, but could be in the countryside as well, because of the conditions faced, we began to see the emergence of collective organization in this country, what we might call the rise of organized labor, or at least the rise of resistance to the changes taking place. This can be both conservative in terms of holding back or pulling back, but also it could be more radical in terms of resistance to the changes taking place. Here we go. If we look back, going back as far as the 1840s or so, with the emergence of this wave of Irish immigration, historians might point to organizations like the Molly Maguires as early antecedents, sort of proto organizations that are connected with labor, connected with individuals who are working under the new circumstances of the factory and manufacturing. Oftentimes, linkages among the members of these groups were ethnic, cultural. So for instance, the Molly Maguires have pulled from an Irish background certain expectations that are not being met in the new world. But there are also certain cultural similarities, commonalities that hold them together. In other words, it's not just about the factory, it's not just about the economy, it's not just about these individuals as laborers. Their actions in terms of labor, their actions in terms of resisting economic change or bringing about economic change are intimately tied to their ethnic connections. Well, after the Civil War, as early as 1877, we began to see the emergence of resistance, organized labor, or organized efforts that are less tied to ethnicity or cultural characteristics and more forcibly directed at economic questions and economic status. One of the most important events of this period toward the end of Reconstruction would be the railroad strike that occurred in 1877. Beginning with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Across West Virginia and parts of Maryland and further west, one of the things we began to see will be workers connected with the railroads taking action to force the owners of these railroads to actually respond to demands. Acts of violence will be committed, weapons used, beatings. One of the incidents occurs in Martinsburg, West Virginia, in July of 1877, when workers actually dragged a fireman and engineer from a locomotive. The purpose being to stop the delivery of goods, of passengers, to bring the railroad to its knees. It makes sense, doesn't it, that the first labor strikes of this kind would be directed at what was really the first corporate entity to begin initiating these changes in the economy. A corporate entity that becomes a model for those corporations to follow. And I'm talking, of course, about the railroad networks that emerge. They had to understand time, space, management techniques. All that is already there. And here, by 1877, we have railroad workers arguing about what these changes mean for them and arguing against the implications. The actual, what we might call the rise of organized labor begins, well, for our story, or our purposes anyway, with an organization known as the Knights of Labor. And it's one that I'd like for you to remember. The Knights of Labor was founded in 1869 by Philadelphia garment cutters. There were perhaps other antecedents, other preliminaries, but the Knights of Labor were the only broad-based union organization to survive the Depression that had occurred in the 1870s. While other organizations, in other words, went belly up, failed, the Knights of Labor survived in this early form. Their thoughts, their ideals, tend to be perhaps somewhat utopian for the day. That is to say, they're very idealistic. Maybe they overreach. I'll let you decide. You can decide based on things you may read here what ultimately went wrong. But you could argue, I think, that the Knights overreached given the time. And yet, in the end, perhaps they went out. They tried to combine both skilled and unskilled workers into a common organization. Later on, of course, there will be other organizations that reject that outright. And the problem, of course, when we talk about skilled and unskilled labor, is that skilled labor really has the skills. That's how they make their money. It's not their time they sell, but it's the skill. And increasingly, that skill is something that serves or comes through the machine. It's something the machine owns. So an unskilled worker or even a semi-skilled worker relies upon the machine. They keep the machine moving. They may use the machine, but ultimately, and this is a key that I forgotten to mention earlier, ultimately the semi-skilled, but more particularly the unskilled worker, is always replaceable. What that means for a labor organization like the Knights of Labor is, if you try and combine skilled workers and unskilled workers, you have a whole portion of your union, of your organization, that is replaceable. And you don't really have the leverage as an unskilled worker with your employer that you do as a skilled worker. Your employer may need your skill, but can easily find someone else to give their time to make the machines run smoothly. And that's the key difference. And that becomes a problem for the Knights of Labor. But in idealistic terms, it's an amazing notion that all workers share in this basic relationship under the new system of corporate entities. And because they share certain interests, they ought to work collectively. Similarly, the Knights of Labor were not particularly concerned about race and allowing you into the organization, nationality, or, for that matter, sex, what your gender was. They believed that women workers should be part of the organization just as male workers were. They did exclude certain people by profession, for instance, gamblers, bankers, doctors, lawyers, liquor dealers, and a few others. As far as a program went, if we want to sum it up, the Knights of Labor at one time or another suggested that what was desirable in terms of labor's interests included equal pay for both sexes, equal pay for men and women, an 8-hour day, abolition of child and prison labor. And prison labor here, of course, means convict labor. They wanted to challenge notions of paper money. They wanted to make sure that it was available. Go back to the old greenbackers, because we talked a bit about money in the South. We talked about the gold standard, etc. They wanted an income tax, a tax that would go after people making vast wealth or making lots of money as opposed to those who had none or who owned property, i.e. Mostly farmers or small business people who may not make a lot of money but were forced to pay taxes on the property that they owned. You also have a call for, from the Knights of Labor, the abolition of America's national banking system, such as it was. And they also tied in their interest with those of prohibitionists. These, of course, are individuals who sought to end the sale, distribution, and often the manufacturing of alcoholic beverages within their state, within their community, or ultimately within the United States. Like all organization, the Knights of Labor grows and then ultimately will find its demise. But there's a recognition with the Knights that the growth of these massive new corporations demands a response not by an individual, sort of a David versus Goliath kind of situation, but by thousands and thousands of little Davids, thousands and thousands of the little people joining together to create for themselves a voice that can compete with the large corporate, that can use the tools of the large corporate entity, the management skills, the control of the press, public information, to try and get the message of the little guy out. By 1879, this effort to organize all of labor had come under the leadership of a gentleman named Terence Powderly, who had been elected Grand Master Workman. In 1879, when Powderly took over, there were approximately 10,000 Knights in the Knights of Labor. The organization would continue to grow, and by about 1886, it would reach its height, at which point it had approximately, or could claim approximately 730,000 members. In the next segment, I want to talk just a bit about what happens to the Knights of Labor and to collective organization like the Knights in the United States after 1886.